Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Daniel Wertz. Daniel is a foreign policy professional, working on non-proliferation issues, sanctions, and the intersection of human rights and humanitarianism, all through a focus on the Korean Peninsula. And importantly for today's podcast, Daniel is also the program manager at NCNK, the National Committee on North Korea, where he has recently published an article entitled The US, North Korea, and Nuclear Diplomacy. And as this becomes the basis for today's podcast, I'll leave a link below in the description. And I highly recommend people read through this article at their own pace. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot that we couldn't get to in today's podcast. Now, North Korea has a deep nuclear history. The shadow of nuclear weapons started during the Korean War, where at one point there was a very real fear that Douglas MacArthur would use nuclear weapons. And when Kim Il-sung petitioned Joseph Stalin for more help, for more assistance, he began to read a reluctance in his Soviet big brother, a fear of getting involved in a nuclear conflict. Even without the use of nuclear weapons, the nuclear shadow was enough to influence and deter nations. So in the 1960s, Kim begins to envision his own nuclear program, his own indigenous program. Through the 1970s, he is assisted by the Soviet Union. And by 1985, North Korea has a 5 megawatt nuclear reactor. And the world of nuclear diplomacy begins to really take note of what was even then a rogue state with emerging nuclear capabilities. But as the 1990s came around, the Cold War also ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. And as North Korea burrowed deeper into a famine, they also had to find new, inventive ways to develop their own nuclear program, if it was in any way going to survive. And America is at the forefront of trying to stop them. In 1994, there is the Agreed Framework. In the early 2000s, the six-party talks. When Barack Obama comes to power, we have strategic patience. And now with Donald Trump, we have maximum pressure and potentially a new era of what Daniel Wertz describes as maximum engagement. Now, there is so much to this story to talk through. So much detail concerning North Korea's actual goals, why they want a nuclear program, and huge doubts and concerns about America's policy, about its strategy of diplomacy, and the future of this process. What will become apparent through this podcast is just how themes seem to repeat themselves. The same problems that were being felt 3 decades ago are still emerging today, still unsolved, still a challenge to the international community. And now, after the Singapore summit, after multiple North-South Korean summits, where the world seems to be deadlocked with North Korea, but also making stuttering progress at the same time, the future of this American North Korean nuclear diplomacy is more important than it has ever been. And to talk us through this today is Daniel Wertz. Now, as always, this podcast is entirely funded by you, the listener, and we are still, in many ways, in our recruitment drive. So if you want it to continue, please consider donating at the Patreon account attached below, www.patreon.com/Jed Lea-Henry. On that, and without any further delay, this is Daniel Wertz. Daniel Wertz, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking through nuclear diplomacy. And this is nuclear diplomacy largely between America and North Korea. So I suppose it's important just to give a very early flag post here, just to let the audience know what we're talking about and why we're talking about these issues. So when it comes to diplomacy with North Korea, why is it always the issue of nuclear weapons? And why is it America that we're always talking about?
Well, for the United States, the issue of North Korea's nuclear program has been really a key foreign policy concern for the past 3 decades. And, it's always been near the top of the U.S. foreign policy agenda, really since the end of the Cold War. And under the Trump administration, it's arguably been issue number 1. The U.S. has been engaged in nuclear diplomacy with North Korea for, a number of reasons. It's, of course, the main signatory to the armistice under the auspice of the United Nations Command. It's a treaty ally of South Korea. It's, leader in global non-proliferation efforts and a global power. But a lot of the main reason that the United States has been the primary interlocutor for nuclear diplomacy with North Korea has been North Korea's insistence that it deal with the United States on this issue. Back in the really early stages of nuclear diplomacy, with North Korea. You actually had a brief moment where South Korea was very directly involved as well. You had the 1992 joint agreement between North and South Korea not to possess, build, use, etc., nuclear weapons, as well as not to possess any enrichment or reprocessing sites to produce fissile material. That agreement never really got off the ground, and it basically was agreed to kind of coterminously with a U.S. DPRK direct agreement in which North Korea agreed to allow IAEA inspections of its suspect nuclear sites. And since that point, it's been the U.S. as the primary interlocutor with North Korea, either directly bilaterally or as the key party to North Korea within multilateral talks, as happened during the Bush administration during the six-party talks.
Now, it may seem quite obvious to many people listening what America wants, though it is a more complicated situation, but it's denuclearization. But I suppose it's very important to touch on, at least at the beginning here, what North Korea want. And you mentioned a few things that I've read here, and you talk about the need for peace and a normalization of relationships, and these details may have shifted over time, but largely they stay the same, at least in their core. And you mentioned this idea that it has to end its hostile policy. And by hostile policy, it talks about three prongs: the economic sanctions or the withholding of aid, the criticism of North Korea and its leaders, and military threats in many ways, which is the military drills.
Yeah, exactly. And with military threats, military drills have been, the issue that North Korea has brought up on many occasions, but it also gets to the broader issue of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, the U.S. Nuclear umbrella in East Asia, and the question of whether or not North Korea's goal is ultimately to get all the U.S. troops removed from the Korean Peninsula, removed from the region. I think a lot of analysts assume that's been North Korea's goal, and that's not necessarily a bad assumption to make. It is worth noting that at several key points, North Korea, at least privately, has expressed a willingness to tolerate a long-term U.S. troop presence on the Korean Peninsula as part of a broader rapprochement with the United States. Most recently, that kind of discussion went on as inter-Korean talks were starting earlier this year. That message was passed from Kim Jong-un to Moon Jae-in, and via Moon Jae-in to the White House.
And there's something interesting that you mentioned here, that despite a lot of these claims that have come out from North Korea, what they're really after, at least underlying all of this, is a recognition, even if it's just a de facto recognition, that they may be a nuclear power. So not a obviously recognized nuclear power, but someone who's just kind of accepted in the background. And the analogy that you use is Pakistan.
Yeah, that's something that the North Koreans have said in different settings. In Track 2 talks, for example, they want to, not necessarily be acknowledged formally as a nuclear power, at least to have the world tolerate their nuclear program and, have relations with the United States, with other countries, where basically all those powers treat North Korea's nuclear program as a fait accompli. At the same time, the North Koreans have talked about their desire for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which I think a straightforward reading of that term would be no nuclear North Korea. U.S. Tactical nuclear weapons have been withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula. They were formerly stationed in South Korea. They were withdrawn in 1991. But when North Korea defines that term, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, they have a somewhat peculiar definition. They talk about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula being an end of U.S. nuclear threats first, and then after that, North Korean denuclearization, nuclear disarmament, might come in the context of global nuclear disarmament. That's, for example, a statement that the North Korean foreign minister made in 2013 described the term denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in those terms. President Trump and Kim Jong-un agreed again to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula when they met in Singapore earlier this year. That term's been brought up on many occasions as diplomacy is restarted. And that's going to be one of the main issues as diplomacy moves forward and we start moving from summits to actual steps forward on progress, hopefully, on the North Korean nuclear program, is getting towards some common definition of what denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula means.
So, before we get into some of the deep history of this, and the history is absolutely fascinating, I suppose we should look at three frames that you present, three frames for how we can understand North Korean motivations. And the first frame in this is North Korea as an isolated state, someone who is deeply insecure, and though despite being deeply insecure, has a deep sense of national pride, and uses a lot of this insecurity and this concern. And that is why they're reaching out to America, because they're trying to guarantee a security that they cannot achieve by themselves due to this isolation.
Yeah, and I think the narrative or the reading of North Korea's actions is that of a very insecure but very nationalistic state. There is a lot of resonance in their history. You can see, I think, their insecurities perhaps stemming from the U.S. bombing campaign during the Korean War. And a lot of proponents of this kind of interpretation of North Korea's motivations would point to that bombing campaign as kind of the starting point of North Korea's sense of extreme insecurity. You can look at North Korea's history throughout the Cold War, where they're surrounded by either enemies, the United States, South Korea, Japan, or by allies whom they can't quite trust. And for advocates of this view of North Korea as an isolated state, I think they look to the early history of nuclear diplomacy with North Korea, to the agreed framework period, and see North Korea's nuclear program basically about trying to leverage the one card they had to play at that time to build up a relationship with the United States, to normalize relations, to be accepted as a normal state in the international system on their terms. And proponents of this view, I think, would point to a few real key turning points or missed opportunities, the biggest one being the U.S. decision to effectively walk away from the agreed framework in 2002 after revelations of North Korea's uranium enrichment program emerged as really crucial moments when North Korea's nuclear program, although it is also a nuclear problem, when their nuclear program became less of a bridge to try to change its relationship with the rest of the world and more of a kind of classical nuclear deterrent. And I think that analysts who take this kind of frame would see some positive things in North Korea's current diplomatic outreach, especially Kim Jong-un's apparent interest in modernizing the economy, in normalizing relations with South Korea, and putting the relationship with the U.S. In a new frame, reaching out to China and Russia, of course.
So the second frame that we should touch on here, and of course there might be some overlap between these three particular frames here. The second frame is, as you mentioned, a hyper-realist state. And this is the idea that it's not going to be alliances that save North Korea or save the North Korean regime, but it's going to be military power. And of course, this is where nuclear weapon comes into it, and where this shadow across North Korea, which many analysts have mentioned, of Libya comes into it. This fear that without nuclear weapons, they can easily go the way of Libya. And there's a fascinating part that you mentioned here, that importantly in all of this is that this idea of an external threat also has this extra element of engendering regime legitimacy and national cohesion.
Yeah, and I think this point of view, and I'd point to scholars such as Andrei Lonkov, who might epitomize it, is that North Korea very much believes in kind of classical realpolitik. Military power is the only kind of power that actually matters, and nuclear weapons are the ultimate form of military power. I think proponents of this view would see North Korea's past behavior in nuclear negotiations as perhaps making tactical concessions at times to ward off pressure, to try to divide the United States, South Korea, China, etc. But their ultimate goal, and it's been a long-standing goal, has been to develop a nuclear arsenal which will allow them both security and freedom of action to do what the country's leaders see fit. And I think that point of view is closely tied, as you point out, with, I think, a sense of North Korea's internal cohesion, internal dynamics, really being bound by the need to maintain a sense of threat, a sense of being under siege, a sense of both the urgency of nuclear weapons for protecting the state and protecting the Korean nation, and the fact that North Korea has been able to build these weapons as a point of national pride, of the leadership being able to say essentially that, you know, we might be hungry, we might not be rich, but we have built up a nuclear arsenal and we're a strong, powerful state despite the whole world being against us. And I think that's a kind of nationalist message that has, you know, that provides a lot of regime legitimacy when they have very few other bases of legitimacy, especially in comparison to South Korea, which of course is much more prosperous, which has a much more open, vibrant society.
So the final frame here, and this one is quite interesting. This is North Korea as a revisionist state. And this is quite a different frame from the first two. This is an idea that rather than for deterrence, this is something quite different. This is that a nuclear program, and nuclear weapons and a missile technology for coercive purposes. And this is something that North Korea often say that they want, and some analysts have picked up on this and say we should take them at their word, and that is they want reunification. And they talk about, when they talk about the final victory, and when they have these long-running negotiations with America, many people see this as an attempt, a step towards reunification. You remove American troops, you then have South Korea on your own, and then you can try, even though it's going to be quite difficult, to have reunification under North Korean auspices.
Yeah, and I think that this view ultimately comes down to a question of ideology and the extent to which North Korea's rulers really believe their own ideology and see themselves, Kim Jong-un sees himself as the person who one day, you know, maybe many years from now, but will be the ruler of a united Korean peninsula, which he deserves to rule as, you know, the heir of the Mount Baekdu lineage. I think that this kind of analysis is perhaps, you know, a worst case scenario, a kind of worst case reading of North Korea's intentions, and as well as its desired capabilities. There's a really big question of how North Korea, even if it managed to defeat South Korea militarily and managed to deter by its nuclear arsenal the U.S. from entering a war on the Korean Peninsula, and those are two big ifs. You know, how would North Korea possibly absorb South Korean society when, you know, even a few K-pop songs and Korean dramas posed such a threat to the regime that they'd put people in prison for listening to this cultural poison. I think that being said, you could say that the whole rationale for the U.S. having a troop presence in South Korea, having an alliance with South Korea, extending the nuclear umbrella over South Korea, is predicated on the assumption that North Korea might indeed have revisionist goals, and that there is a strong need to deter North Korea and to have such overwhelming power relative to North Korea that option is completely unviable for the North Korean leadership, and that they know it.
So before we get into the first nuclear crisis here, a final question. We should look through the broader US strategy here and across all the decades that this has been going on for. And as you mentioned, this has been almost a 30-year policy that we speak to North Korea. And in many ways, this is understandable. The alternative to denuclearizing them by diplomacy is denuclearizing them by force. And this is potentially millions of deaths in North and South Korea, maybe beyond. But one of the other important parts about this that people often say is by this extreme focus on denuclearization, and America and its allies focusing just on this particular aspect of it, what is often being allowed to slip by is that North Korea's human rights abuses are shuffled to the side and they don't become the important issue that many people see them to be.
Yeah, and I think that whenever diplomacy with North Korea over their nuclear program takes center stage, human rights becomes much less of a focus for U.S. Policy toward the Korean Peninsula. And I think you've seen this very dramatically just this year when President Trump, I think the most notable moment of his State of the Union address this year was when he invited North Korean defector Ji Sung-ho as one of his guests of honor, referenced North Korea's many human rights abuses. And just a few months later, Trump was meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore. He was basically downplaying North Korean human rights abuses, saying, they do bad things, so do a lot of countries. And just a few weeks ago, saying how he and Kim Jong-un fell in love. That's a remarkable turnaround in the space of a year. And I think it speaks a lot Trump's, approach personally towards human rights and towards dictatorial regimes. But to a milder extent, that's been the case with other presidents as well, putting human rights on the back burner. And of course, there are other analysts who'd argue, I think along a similar line of logic, we shouldn't put the nuclear issue first and foremost above everything else. But instead of emphasizing human rights in North Korea and the need, and highlighting the atrocities taking place there, some analysts would argue we need to engage with North Korea, build a relationship, allow North Korea to have a more normal relationship with the world, feel more secure, and with North Korea feeling more secure, that will lessen their need or desire or feeling that they need nuclear weapons for their own security. And that gets back to the frame of North Korea as an isolated state that we discussed earlier.
So let's get to some of the history of this. And a lot of the issues that we've mentioned there and some of the issues that we've missed, they will begin to bleed out through this history. And this is quite a fascinating sort of roller coaster ride, this history. So this period up until the agreed framework is quite an interesting one. So it runs through a few different areas, 1950s to 1960s, when there is this first nascent idea that North Korea wants its own nuclear program. In the 1970s, when Kim Il-sung begins to reach out to the Soviet Union and begin to develop its own indigenous nuclear program. In the 1980s, they have their first 5 megawatt reactor built. And then the end of the Cold War comes. So I might get you to talk through that period for us, because that sets the scene nicely for what we're going to come up to next, which is the agreed framework.
Yeah, so with the end of the Cold War, North Korea's international position was really undercut. Their domestic position was really undercut as well. They've got North Korea's two really key allies, the Soviet Union and China, establishing diplomatic relations with South Korea, basically abandoning the one Korea policy that they'd had throughout the Cold War. And very shortly after that, of course, the Soviet Union collapses. Soviet subsidized fuel to North Korea stops flowing, which, combined with long-standing poor economic policies in North Korea, leads to total economic collapse and eventually famine. Really, at this point, the one strong card North Korea has is the fact that they've got a nuclear program which has grabbed the attention of the United States. Between 1989 and 1991, they'd already begun reprocessing relatively limited quantities of plutonium, enough for perhaps 1 or 2 crude nuclear weapons. So as the U.S. and South Korea embark on, having a very different relationship themselves with the world. It's the end of the Cold War. South Korea is reaching out through its Nordpolitik policy to former enemies in the communist bloc. They've got, a recalcitrant North Korean state that's not going away, with the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc that seems to have a growing nuclear weapons program. So there is a decision to engage with North Korea, to try to meet some of what North Korea wants, to allow IAEA inspections of its nuclear program. North Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty under Soviet pressure in 1985, but never signed any needed follow-up agreements for IAEA inspections of its facilities. So the U.S. and South Korea, basically, the U.S. withdraws its tactical nuclear weapons from South Korea. This is part of a global drawdown on U.S. tactical nuclear deployments, but it's also something that the North Koreans had articulated as a demand for them, for the U.S. to meet before North Korea would allow in IAEA inspectors. The U.S. and South Korea cancel these joint military exercises, Team Spirit, which North Korea had been very vigorously denouncing and had said is another marker of what would have to happen. The cancellation would have to happen for North Korea to accept IAEA inspections. So with those two actions, that actually opened the door, at least for a short time, for high-level inter-Korean engagement, high-level U.S.-North Korea engagement. It led to the joint declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula between North and South, which I mentioned earlier. It led to a basic agreement between North and South, laying out a really ambitious program of inter-Korean cooperation, opening, and a normalization of relations. And it led to the first high-level U.S.-North Korea diplomatic meeting in 1992 between Undersecretary of State Arnold Cantor and a top North Korean diplomat. That led to North Korea accepting IAEA inspections. But when the IAEA came in, they found some real discrepancies at North Korea's Yongbyon facility. Keep in mind, the international context at this time. This is right after the Gulf War, when it was revealed that that Saddam Hussein's Iraq had a much more robust nuclear program than the rest of the world knew about. It was something of a wake-up call for the non-proliferation community and for the IAEA. So as the IAEA detects these discrepancies in Yongbyon, they call for something called a special inspection, which it's the first time with any country the IAEA had asked for this kind of special inspection. It's their kind of anytime, anywhere inspection superpower, you could call it, that had not been previously invoked for good reason because it could easily precipitate a diplomatic crisis. And that's exactly what it did, leading to North Korean threat to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That was held off after a round of diplomacy with the U.S., which led to a 1993 joint U.S. DPRK declaration on normalization of relations. But that declaration didn't quite get things on track. The IAEA subsequently still had trouble getting access to the facilities that they wanted to get access to. And then North Korea brought the situation to a head by removing some of its spent fuel from its main reactor at Yongbyon, starting the process of getting ready to reprocess it to produce plutonium. And that's where, when Jimmy Carter made his famous trip to Pyongyang to meet with Kim Il-sung, negotiated, unofficially of course, the outlines of what would become the agreed framework. And despite Kim Il-sung's death shortly after that, with several months of intense U.S.-North Korea negotiations, you had the agreed framework on North Korea's nuclear program.
Well, let's talk through that agreeing framework, because this is one of those one of those watershed moments in North Korean nuclear diplomacy. And of course, this is 1994, and this is a long time ago. Many people won't remember, but this is a period where the world felt very, very, very close to war, and the Clinton administration seriously considered this conflict, because, as you mentioned, they have noticed in that North Korea are removing this extracted plutonium, and this is, they assume, for warheads, or at least for nuclear tests. And so I suppose it's important to talk through just what that agreed framework did, because this is one of the first great major landmark agreements between the two countries, at least in this modern era.
Yeah, so the agreed framework, it basically did two big things. It froze North Korea's nuclear program, and it promised the normalization of U.S.-North Korea relations. Activities at Yongbyon, North Korea's main nuclear site, where it was producing plutonium, were halted. Two larger reactors that were under construction at the time, construction on them was also halted. They basically became defunct projects. And that was, I think, an unsung win for the agreed framework, because the CIA was estimating that by the time those reactors became operational, they could produce very large amounts of fissile material, enough for perhaps a dozen warheads every year. Those became defunct. And the US agreed to form a consortium in which they would build a proliferation-resistant light water reactor in North Korea, ostensibly to replace the energy that North Korea would forgo by giving up its domestic nuclear program. And the agreement was structured so that initially North Korea would freeze its nuclear activities. The US and its partners would start construction of the light water reactors. but before the core of the light water reactors were put in place, North Korea would take the next steps on Yongbyon and basically ship its remaining spent fuel out of the country, basically dismantle the rest of its nuclear program rather than just keep it frozen. And in the meantime, while the light water reactors were being built, the US and its partners would ship heavy fuel oil to North Korea to provide energy. And the agreement, of course, also outlined the eventual normalization of US-North Korea relations, an end to sanctions. And as implementation started in the years ahead, the freeze part of the agreed framework was effective in stopping activities at Yongbyon, halting the plutonium program for a while. The normalization of relations between US and North Korea proceeded pretty slowly. North Korea actually, after lengthy negotiations, rejected a US offer to set up an interest section in Pyongyang, and for North Korea to set up its own interest section in Washington, basically these kind of precursors to embassies in the two countries' capitals. There were a number of tense military and security issues that occurred while the agreed framework was in place. Right after it was signed, there was a U.S. helicopter that strayed over the DMZ and was shot down by the North Koreans. One of the pilots was killed. His co-pilot was captured and eventually returned to the U.S. There was in 1996 an incident in which a North Korean submarine bringing a group of North Korean Special Forces commandos into South Korea ran aground. North Korea's soldiers basically tried to fight their way back north, led to a huge manhunt in South Korea. It was a major crisis. And in 1998, of course, you had North Korea's first long-range missile test, which they claimed was actually a launch of a satellite, trying to put a small satellite into orbit. When they conducted this test, the rocket overflew Japan. It became a major international crisis and became something of a wake-up call for the U.S. There were calls from more conservative voices to ditch the agreed framework, to take a more aggressive approach. But the Clinton administration, on the advice of former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, decided to basically double down on engagement with North Korea. Started what was called the Perry process of more intensified engagement, with the idea that if engagement didn't work, the U.S. would fall back on a policy of containment. And the Perry process actually led to some real momentum in U.S.-North Korea relations. It also coincided with Kim Dae-jung entering office in South Korea on a platform of the Sunshine Policy of engaging with the North. So you had, really for the first time, a lot of overlap between the U.S. and South Korea in wanting to really robustly engage with the North. You had some progress in terms of the U.S. and North Korea negotiating access for the U.S. to a suspect nuclear site at a place called Kumchang-ri, which turned out not to have the kind of suspected facilities that some parts of the U.S. intelligence community believed were there. And you had two high-level visits. First, high-ranking North Korean official Jo Mung-rok traveling to Washington, followed shortly by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright traveling to Pyongyang. The U.S. and North Korea talking about a missile deal in which North Korea would accept significant constraints on its ballistic missile program. There was progress in those talks, but it wasn't quite complete by the end of the Clinton administration. And ultimately, President Clinton was strongly considering a visit to Pyongyang to follow up on Madeleine Albright's visit, but for a number of factors, decided not to do so in the waning months of his presidency. And then you had the Bush administration come in, which had a much different set of ideas about how to deal with North Korea.
Well, let's talk about that period leading up to George Bush. And I'm glad you mentioned the Perry process there, because that's one of the themes that seems to emerge here as we run through this, that presidents come into power, this is American presidents, and towards the end of their term, despite whatever process they've been going through, they have a flurry of diplomacy, as if they're trying to at least reach out and make some progress that they failed to make throughout their 4 or 8 years in power. And one of the things that Clinton, the Clinton administration does this towards the end of its time in power. And George Bush comes in, and there's some mixed signals at first. And then there's this famous speech that everyone is aware of when September 11 happens in New York, and George Bush declares that North Korea is part of an axis of evil, along with Iran and Iran. And for many people, this was a pivotal moment. This set North Korea down a nuclear path, or a path that was much more hostile to America, because what other choice did they have? But some other analysts have said North Korea had been provoking America and stoking war and all this rhetoric for years, and the worst they got was a nasty line in a speech. But whatever the outcome there is, they do take a turn. And this North Korea start talking again about a nuclear deterrence force, and getting America to stop their hostile policy. So I might get you to lead us up until the six-party talks, if you can.
Yeah, and the real, I think, crucial turning point, which I mentioned earlier, came a few months after the Axis of Evil speech, in which Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Jim Kelly and a U.S. delegation went to Pyongyang to basically confront North Korea over procurements for a secret uranium enrichment program, which would have given them a second path to build nuclear weapons, which would have been a violation of at least the spirit of the agreed framework. The agreed framework itself didn't explicitly mention a prohibition on uranium programs. It did mention the joint declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which prohibited both North and South Korea from having enrichment programs. But when James Kelly and his delegation went to North Korea, they were under very strict orders to basically lay down the law and not to negotiate with the North Koreans. They were to send a message. And somewhat surprisingly, when the North Koreans heard what Assistant Secretary Kelly had to say, they basically admitted to having this enrichment program. They said that, we're entitled to it. We're entitled to nuclear weapons if we want them. The exact words they used became a point of dispute, because they later said, well, we never admitted to having an enrichment program in those talks. And it's unclear exactly what they said, but I think according to U.S. participants in those meetings, they clearly implied it. But they also seemed to indicate during that meeting in Pyongyang in October 2002 that they were willing to negotiate over their enrichment program, that it would be on the table potentially if the Americans would be willing to negotiate over it. But the Bush administration decided not to try to salvage the agreed framework at that point. They cut off fuel oil shipments under the agreed framework. This led North Korea to walk away from the agreement, to expel the IAEA from Yongbyon, to restart that reactor. And over the next few years, taking spent fuel out of the reactor, reprocessing it to plutonium, and building up a small arsenal of perhaps half a dozen nuclear weapons by 2005, when diplomacy really started getting going again. And the Bush administration was really internally divided about how to deal with North Korea. You had some hawks, I think really led at the time by figures including John Bolton, who of course is a relevant figure for North Korea diplomacy again today. And you had people who advocated a more moderate approach, who wanted to find a diplomatic solution. And you had two kind of parallel policy trajectories emerge within the Bush administration. You had one, the pressure track. Basically, there was this initiative within the U.S. government trying to put as much economic pressure on North Korea as they could in order to get them to make concessions on the nuclear program. And there was the diplomatic track, the six-party talks, in which the U.S., North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, and Russia would engage in a multilateral forum to try to negotiate an end to the North Korean nuclear program. And the multilateral format was important to the Bush administration because they didn't want to give North Korea the legitimacy of bilateral talks with the U.S. And, it makes sense to have this kind of two-track approach, pressure and talks. That's kind of diplomacy 101. But it really seemed like the two approaches were, at times at least, working against each other. And this was certainly the case in 2005, when you had, really within days of each other, the first major breakthrough at the six-party talks, the September 19th, 2005 joint statement on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and a U.S. Financial sanction against a Macau-based bank, Banco Delta Asia, for facilitating illicit North Korean activities, for accepting laundered North Korean money. So we had this strange moment where we had a diplomatic breakthrough and a big ramp up in pressure at the same time. And the September 19th agreement basically became stillborn. Immediately after its the U.S. designation against Banco Delta Asia, the Treasury Department basically sent its officials on a worldwide tour trying to persuade international bankers and foreign governments not to conduct any kind of financial transactions with North Korea, to make the case that there would be risks to any banks that did business with North Korea. And as diplomacy floundered, North Korea's nuclear program moved forward, ultimately leading to their first nuclear test in 2006. And the Bush administration, responding to this test, ultimately made the decision to try to re-engage with North Korea. And around 2007, 2008, you had really for the first time in the Bush administration, robust diplomatic efforts that had high-level support. And I think this gets back to the point you made earlier about it's at the end of most U.S. administrations where diplomacy with North Korea gets serious, because U.S. presidents want to have something positive in their legacy in dealing with North Korea. They want to try to improve the situation.
So that's a great overview. Sorry, that's a great overview there of that period. And of course, we're moving to, as you mentioned, towards the end of the George Bush period and towards Barack Obama and this era of strategic patience. So as we move forward here, there are a few things that happen, I suppose, that have to be mentioned. In 2008, Kim Jong-il has a stroke, and a leadership transition doesn't happen, but begins to be put in train, of course. And there's as you mentioned there, the imposition of a stronger and stronger sanctions regime, and then with this reach out. And it's important that you mentioned there that this idea that in 2006 they had their nuclear test, and this spurred the George Bush administration to re-engage. Because when Barack Obama comes into power, they have this policy, and it has the name of strategic patience, which is quite derided these days. But the idea was this, and this is a quote, that they should break the cycle of provocation, extortion, and reward. The idea that North Korea just provoke and provoke and provoke, and that we give them whatever they want so that they stop these provocations.
Yeah, and President Obama, of course, campaigned on a platform of being willing to engage with adversaries during his inaugural speech. I think the most famous line was his reference to extending an open hand to adversaries if they're willing to unclench their fists. And in the early months of the Obama administration, North Korea was definitely not willing to unclench its fist. The Bush administration made some progress in the six-party talks in 2007, 2008. By the end of 2008, that was starting to break down. And really, Obama's first major foreign policy crisis while in office was a North Korean long-range missile test, followed shortly by their second nuclear test. And, this set the pattern for a lot of the Obama administration, where President Obama was trying to, as you say, break out of that cycle of negotiations, deadlock, and failure to try to do something different, even as he's willing to engage with North Korea and willing to kind of gradually ramp up sanctions pressure. So there were, critics of strategic patience, I think both on the left and right. There were advocates of engagement who basically saw strategic patience as far too inactive of a policy, who argued that it was basically premised on the idea that North Korea is not going to survive a third-generation leadership transition, and that economic pressure from relatively narrowly tailored sanctions focused on North Korean military and proliferation activities would be enough to perhaps get them back to the table on better terms. And you had people from the more hawkish side saying we need to do a lot more to pressure North Korea. We need really robust sanctions. People are calling for the Obama administration to apply the same kind of approach to North Korea as the Obama administration was applying to Iran, having these, this really major effort to find every point of leverage for economic pressure and to apply it to North Korea. But, ultimately, strategic patience won the day for a lot of the Obama administration until in 2016, I think it was clear that that it just was not working. North Korea's economy was doing better. Kim Jong-un had clearly been able to transition to become the new leader of North Korea. North Korea's nuclear program was getting a lot more robust. So you start seeing really the start of the pressure campaign that I think the first year of the Trump administration is associated with, starting in the last year of the Obama administration with a big ramp up in sanctions.
And you mentioned there, and we should touch on this, that the economy was improving, and Kim Jong-un had come into power and cemented himself. And one of the important parts of this is his policy of the Bunjin line, which is this joint policy. So it used to be military first, which of course nuclear weapons were part of this. This was Songun, and now it's a revised policy where you have this dual track, where you improve the economy on one side and you improve the military on the other. And as you mentioned there, this seems to have helped. This seems to have made an impact. But there was also some other moments there, such as in 2010, there was the torpedoing of the SSS Chonan and the shelling of Yonpyeong Island, which of course many people saw as part of this leadership transition. And this begins to lead us, of course, slowly towards the end of Barack Obama's term in office and towards a change in policy. So you have this newly cemented leader in power with this new policy that seems to be working. He seems to be quite solid in there. And then you have a unexpected election in America, at least unexpected election of Donald Trump, and a change in policy towards maximum pressure.
Yeah, and of course, President Obama told President Trump shortly before he entered office that North Korea would be one of the biggest foreign policy challenges he'd face. And it became clear, I think around 2016, 2017, that North Korea's nuclear program and ballistic missile program were a lot more sophisticated than many observers believed. North Korea had managed to do fairly well economically, enjoy at least modest growth due to the Byungjin policy, which you mentioned, due to Kim Jong-un's willingness to tolerate, to a greater extent than his grandfather, market forces in North Korea. And North Korea's increasing trade with China at that time also really played a key role in North Korean economic growth and stability during the transition period. North Korea-China trade grew by something on the order of 250% in the 5 years from 2009 to 2014, when North Korea was nominally under UN sanctions. And as North Korea's economic ties with China deepened, they were actually able to gain better access to the global economy to purchase things like computer numerical control machines that are really crucial for producing more advanced missiles and for producing centrifuges. So in 2017, you had continued ramp up of U.S. and international sanctions pressure, more UN resolutions, more U.S. Laws and executive orders ramping up U.S. secondary sanctions targeting third country entities doing business with North Korea. And you also had this really unprecedented pattern of, first of all, name calling at a pretty high level. Little Rocket Man threats at the UN, which is a very Trumpian thing. And you had very serious consideration, I believe, of military options against North Korea. And I think that some people in the Trump administration believed North Korea to basically have this kind of revisionist approach, that they were acquiring nuclear weapons for essentially coercive purposes to decouple the U.S. and South Korea, to ultimately subjugate South Korea. I think that H.R. McMaster, the former national security advisor, articulated this most clearly and definitively among Trump administration advisors. So you've got, ramp up of economic pressure, of military pressure. The military threats, maybe they scare the North Koreans, maybe not, but they certainly scare the South Koreans. They scare the Chinese. And I think that brings us to the situation we have now, where North Korea has had a pretty rapid change in policy from all these missile tests and nuclear tests to engaging with the US, China, South Korea in a very high level, where the South Koreans clearly want to re-engage with North Korea to try to prevent any possibility that a war could break out on the Korean Peninsula. And where the Chinese were, I think, perhaps partially because of U.S. military threats, more willing to pass and then to enforce sanctions last year. Now they're perhaps hedging a little bit in their sanctions enforcement and trying to emphasize stability rather than denuclearization, which has been their kind of fallback preference for a long time.
So that's a very interesting shift there. So I suppose something that has to be mentioned there is behind those tweets and behind that rhetoric, which of course, as you mentioned, is very Trumpian, there was a silent diplomacy, at least a back channel happening the whole way. And I suppose that many people consider this a success of maximum pressure, the very real threat of war on one hand, with a back channel and a way out, a release valve on the other. And as we walk towards it, as you mentioned, this change in policy, it's actually quite rapid when you look at it. And at the end of 2017, in Kim Jong-un's New Year's Eve address, he says that they have completed their nuclear program, they've completed their missile program, and now what they'll be doing is simply amassing nuclear warheads and amassing the right amount of missiles. And then within a month, there's an olive branch handed out to South Korea. South Korea accept, and you have this show of the Olympics down in Pyeongchang in South Korea, and a shift. And you've mentioned, and you've labeled this shift, okay, I suppose quite appropriate, maximum engagement now. So I might get you to talk us through that.
Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable and very sudden about face for North Korea and, of course, for the Trump administration. I'm not completely sold on the idea that maximum pressure is what got the North Koreans to change their tune. I think it's easy to see a narrative where Kim Jong-un decided, basically, I'm going to do as much in a short period of time to make the technical progress we need on our nuclear program, bear the diplomatic and economic costs of doing that. We'll get, a real nuclear deterrent. And then once we've made enough progress to feel secure, then we'll go about trying to repair all those relationships, trying to go on a charm offensive and, improve relations and make our nuclear progress basically a fait accompli. I think that the North Korean economy, at least, has been pretty resilient in the face of sanctions over the past few years. I think the most important data point is probably the black market exchange rate for the North Korean won, which has stayed remarkably stable. That's something you would not expect if North Korea is, facing a hard currency crisis due to sanctions, but it stayed basically flat, 8,000 won to the dollar for the past few years. Food prices have stayed fairly flat. Fuel prices jumped up a little bit in 2017. They've fallen to a lesser extent since then, but North Korea is not facing economic collapse, and the extent to which their about face was the result of the economic side of maximum pressure, I think, was perhaps the prospective long-term threat of sanctions, not the immediate impact. But, Kim Jong-un seems to be serious at the same time about economic modernization. I think that's part of what's driving him right now. He gave a pretty important speech before a central committee meeting of the Workers' Party, basically announcing in around April or May of this year an end to the Byungjin line. He said the Byungjin line had been successful and now it's economy first. And since then, he's gone on, a lot of field visits, going to factories, farms, etc., really emphasizing science and technology. I think that North Korea is still a very long way from Deng Xiaoping-style reform and opening. I think they have no interest whatsoever in the open part of that equation. They've got some interest in reform, but won't go too far on that. But it remains, I think, a question as they've engaged diplomatically with South Korea, with the United States, with other countries. What's their end goal here? And I think that is a really important task for our diplomats and South Koreans to try to figure out. What are they willing to give up as far as their nuclear program goes? What are Kim Jong-un's long-term goals? Does he want to become a member of the international community? Does he want to modernize his economy? Is he willing to at least pare back his nuclear program and perhaps in the long run eliminate it? Or is he simply taking a page out of his father and grandfather's playbook, putting on a term offensive, but he'll be back to his old ways before we know it?
So walking closer and closer to the present moment here, you importantly mentioned quite a few important things there. And one of them, after that outreach between the two Koreas, between South Korea and North Korea, they have these summits. And Kim Jong-un sends, of course, a personal message to Donald Trump, not through the State Department, not through official channels, but through South Korean diplomats. And Donald Trump, as Donald Trump often does, accepted it in the moment. And then you have this summit building up and some other moments here. So I might get you to walk us through the Singapore summit, because after the summit, you have Donald Trump declaring the issue to be largely solved, and you have some issues such as the demolition or the shutdown of North Korea's nuclear site, but it's not witnessed by IAEA inspectors or even experts in nuclear technology, but by journalists, foreign journalists, of course, but journalists. And just after the summit, of course, you have, the appointment of John Bolton back into the fray, and he mentions something that quite upsets the North Koreans. He says we should pursue this in terms of the Libyan model.
Yeah, well, I think North Korea gave up some pretty small measures at the summit as far as its nuclear program goes, as you alluded to. Before the summit, they invited journalists to watch the demolition of their nuclear test site. Afterwards, they partially demolished a missile test stand, a site that's important for their satellite launches and also for testing the engines of their long-range missiles. That has some importance, and that's one of many necessary steps on the way toward rolling back North Korea's nuclear program, but it's just one of many, many steps. I'd say the most important measure that North Korea has taken so far this year is simply not conducting any more long-range or any ballistic missile tests, not conducting more nuclear tests, because they really stopped right before an important threshold. They tested an ICBM, the Hwasong-15, late last year, which would have the capability of hitting just about anywhere in the continental United States and is large enough to carry a pretty sizable warhead with it. One test of a ballistic missile like that isn't enough to have a highly credible deterrent. It's not certain whether or not they have a reentry vehicle. Other militaries that have developed long-range ICBMs, they test them over and over and over again for reliability, for making sure that they actually work. So I'd say North Korea right now, they're stopped at the point where they could perhaps threaten the U.S. with an ICBM strike if they were desperate, and they'd have a perhaps small chance of that working. But they're not at the point where they can coerce the United States, where they can, make a certain threat that, their ICBMs can hit the U.S. mainland. And I think with a few more missile tests, they'd be at that point. So by, holding off on missile tests, I think that buys us a lot of space to actually, do the work of negotiating. I mean, the Singapore summit itself, there was a lot of flash. There was a lot of media attention. There wasn't too much substance, though, in terms of either creating a roadmap for denuclearization or towards normalizing U.S.-North Korea relations. There still haven't been really routine working level talks, at least that have been publicly announced on the diplomatic side. There's been a number of visits by Mike Pompeo to Pyongyang, but you can't have the Secretary of State negotiate every little bit of a very complex nuclear agreement. And Secretary Pompeo's most important role so far has been, it seems, to lay the groundwork just for first the Singapore summit, and now the follow-up summit that might take place next year. I think the one really big move that came with the Singapore summit was the Trump administration's, or really President Trump's decision to suspend U.S. South Korea military exercises. That's something that had been a key North Korean demand. And President Trump seemed to buy into the North Korean rhetoric on these exercises, referring to them as war games, complaining about their cost. And according to some reports, he also indicated his willingness to have the U.S. and the two Koreas make an end-of-war declaration, basically saying that the U.S. and North Korea are no longer in a state of war, and kind of setting the start of a process for a peace treaty. That was North Korea's key demand right after the Singapore summit, to follow up on that end-of-war declaration, to follow up on President Trump's apparent pledge to do that. The North Koreans have kind of refocused their demands a little more recently on sanctions relief, which is, I think, something that's it's something that they ultimately want more and are probably feeling the need for sanctions relief. And it's obviously less symbolic than just an end of war declaration would be. So as the U.S. and North Korea moved toward a second round of Kim-Trump symmetry, as working level negotiations perhaps get off the ground, I think this issue of the timing and nature of sanctions relief will be a really, really key issue, because the Trump administration, their mantra has been that there will be no sanctions relief until North Korean denuclearization. And personally, I think that's unrealistic, that North Korea will give up their whole nuclear program and just accept on faith that the U.S. will give up sanctions afterward. The South Koreans clearly are interested in economic re-engagement with North Korea. They want to start off by building or rebuilding inter-Korean roads, rail, and they would need sanctions relief at the UN level to be able to do that. The Chinese and the Russians have also called for an approach of phased sanctions relief. So the key question, I think, will be, is the Trump administration willing to do something on this, willing to show some more flexibility on its position, or will it just be more kind of buddy-buddy, Chairman Kim, President Trump meetings, and wherever their next summit might be, without any more substance on moving the denuclearization ball forward?
So just on that question there of sanctions relief, it is important, because this comes up a lot in a lot of the media here, that it is South Korea that often, when the missiles are being launched and when the nuclear weapons are being tested, that they ask the international community for this help, that they want it to be an international problem, not a Korean problem. They want this reach out. And then as soon as North Korea opens the hand and asks for help, it is the South Koreans that immediately ask for breaks and restrictions in those sanctions. And one of the things that's been at least claimed a lot by analysts in the media is that South Korea have this feeling towards sanctions, sanctions towards North Korea, that they are international sanctions. and that it is South Korea's right in some ways to break them as they are, because when it comes to peace, this at least is the claim, when it comes to peace, this is a Korean issue, and when it comes to conflict, it's an international problem.
Yeah, there's I think some people in South Korea who make that kind of argument that there are international sanctions against North Korea, but inter-Korean relations are essentially a domestic issue, so maybe the UN sanctions don't apply. The argument's out there. The South Korean government, though, the Moon Jae-in administration, has not endorsed that interpretation. And they've been, I think, quite cautious, actually. First in 2017, as sanctions were wrapping up, being on the same page with the Trump administration in encouraging more economic pressure on the North. And as they've started re-engaging earlier this year in getting exemptions to UN sanctions to, for example, allow North Korean athletes and certain North Korean leaders and diplomats to come to South Korea to engage with the North in other ways. Even as at the same time, they've had their own process of diplomatic re-engagement with North Korea and have made some promises about economic re-engagement that would require sanctions relief at the UN and possibly US level in order to carry out. So South Korea's kind of short-term objective, what they've been talking about with the North, is the kind of first major project is the inter-Korean railroad and inter-Korean roads, modernizing, rebuilding those. So to be able to do that, they need to get several big exemptions from the UN, exemptions to UN restrictions on joint ventures, on the export of metals and machinery to North Korea, on potentially some of the financial sanctions, because for a big infrastructure project like that, you'd have to be moving money across borders. I think that if there is a kind of phased sanctions relief process, that creating exemptions for that kind of project first might make some sense, of course, in conjunction with appropriate North Korean actions on its nuclear program. Number one, out of a concern for alliance management. Number two, because if it's constructed appropriately, it wouldn't necessarily be providing hard currency or resources directly to the North Korean regime, just rebuilding some of those roads, railroads. And I think that, the sanctions regime, both at the UN and US level, is very complex. It's very multi-layered. But there, I think, are ways to kind of peel back the sanctions layer by layer to offer carrots to North Korea, to offer economic incentives at different stages of negotiation, while still keeping the bulk of the sanctions regime intact. I think, for example, beyond the inter-Korean projects, a first kind of step on a phased sanctions relief process could be an offer in conjunction with North Korean action on its nuclear program, perhaps a freeze of fissile material production to allow North Korea to again import crude oil and refined oil and gasoline at pre-sanctions levels. I think that would be a kind of logical first step, because that aspect of the sanctions regime is naturally more reversible than other aspects. It's easy to, start or stop exporting fuel to North Korea. It's a lot harder to start or stop North Korea's access to the international financial system, or its ability to form joint ventures. So those sectoral sanctions, I think, are a logical first step at the UN level for sanctions relief. Maybe moving a little beyond that, again, with commensurate North Korean action on its nuclear program, you could start resuming projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex or Mount Gumgang tours, which are these inter-Korean projects of days past, which have been suspended at different points. And ultimately, I think U.S. sanctions relief and North Korea's reconnection to the international financial system to become a normal part of the international economy would have to be commensurate with denuclearization, with the whole issue being resolved. But there's a lot of steps you can do on the way there to kind of leverage sanctions to use a step-by-step approach.
So as a final question, I might get us to analyze a little bit about Donald Trump and to gaze into the future. Now, you mentioned a few times that, and it's very interesting towards the end of this article, you talk about the same complex problems that have been throughout the decades of these nuclear negotiations keep returning, but they are being magnified now by by mismanaged expectations, which is symptomatic of the Trump administration. And one of those particular challenges, I suppose this is an insight into how North Korea, I suppose, have quite intelligently played the American administration, is this idea that North Korea has criticized the American administration, but have tended, at least recently, to refrain away from criticizing Donald Trump, and have praised Donald Trump while criticizing the administration to give this separation there. And this is where, as you mentioned earlier, you get these comments by Donald Trump, such as how he fell in love and how he received beautiful letters. It's an interesting strategy on their behalf of how to approach America. And there's one last thought there that you mentioned, and it's very good towards the end of your article. You say, despite all of this, at the end game in this process will ultimately be down to decisions made solely inside Pyongyang.
Yeah. And, I think the North Koreans, like a lot of countries, were initially perplexed about how to deal with Donald Trump, but have come to the realization that, playing to President Trump's ego and having a personal relationship and, creating a stage for President Trump is how you make progress with this administration. And they seem to have continued with that strategy by their offer to hold a second summit with President Trump sometime soon. It's my hope that we can get a more normal diplomatic process in place at the working level, either before or immediately after that summit. But we'll see whether or not that happens. Ultimately, though, I think that Kim Jong-un has to make a strategic decision about, is he going to denuclearize? Is he going to try to modernize his economy? Is he going to try to have improved relations with South Korea and the U.S. on a sustained basis? Or is this just a kind of tactical maneuver? And I think the actions that the Trump administration takes, the South Koreans take, that the Chinese take, those all shape the environment for Kim Jong-un's decision-making. It shapes what outcomes he might be able to get to, but it ultimately doesn't shape the decision that he might have to make, and perhaps has already made, about how he wants to move this process forward and what his end game is. And I'm not certain that Kim Jong-un has a definitive end game in mind at this point in the process. I think that North Korea certainly has a strategy, but at the same time, they're willing to improvise, they're willing to respond to the situation as it evolves.
So that's a good note to end things on, I suppose. So the article that we've been talking through today is titled "The U.S., North Korea, and Nuclear Diplomacy." I'll attach a link below this podcast. I recommend people go to access it. It really is a fascinating read and a great insight into not just the history, but the current analysis of where nuclear diplomacy with North Korea is heading. So Daniel Wertz, thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jed.